Hey, this is Chris with Phoenix Gaming. Today we're going to review Warhammer The Old World. Before we dig in, I want to let everybody know the first news segment is coming this week. I've been just kind of like working with the community to figure out how I'm going to structure it. My first supporter drawing is this week. Like I said before, if you support on Patreon or Fourth Wall or anything like that, at the end of the month, I'm going to do a drawing, and then one of the winners is going to we get to play a game together of their choice. And whether that game's on TTS or in person is going to depend on, location and everything else. But that's the plan. Also, the Veerman command units, that review is coming, so stay tuned for that for my Firefight players. I'm going to do a quick walkthrough of how I do reviews, and then we'll kind of dig in. What are we looking at when we are reviewing tabletop and board games? Like I said, I rate everything on a scale of 1 to 5. 1 is just like, man, this game sucks. And 5 is, this is amazing, pinnacle of gaming. And, we look at the ease, how easy is the game in terms of rules, but also how easy is it to get into, their interactivity. Is there a lot of mechanics that override another player's ability to play? Do you both feel like you're playing a game, or does it feel like two people playing a game by themselves at the same table? Investment, and that's one of those like looks at a little bit both the time and the money. It's not just one or the other. And then fit and finish, and that's just kind of a catch-all for our, is the board nice, or the book's nice, or the model's nice, everything else. And probably for some bigger games, we'll also kind of wrap in like maintenance. Does the company maintain the game? Kind of fold that into the fit and finish. Not everything needs that, so it won't be in every review, obviously. Before I get into this, there's a couple things I need to say. Games Workshop, games, and IP can be pretty polarizing and divisive. If you don't like something that I say because you love Games Workshop, that's okay. I'm not trying to instigate or start fights. I'm just trying to give you what I feel is a fairly objective opinion. I try not to, when I do reviews, let my emotions bleed into it. However, some of my opinions will bleed into it. How I think games should play will kind of bleed into it. But if I love something, like I love Warhammer Fantasy, or I love, or I hate Star Wars, right? Like I don't like Star Wars. That doesn't mean I'm going to instantly give a Star Wars game a bad review just because I don't like Star Wars. I will give the game as fair of a shake as I can, with the understanding that just because I don't like the source material doesn't mean that the game's going to be bad. This is a big part of why I've avoided reviewing any GW games, though, is because they can be so divisive. And before, again, I don't mean to have these long intros, but a good example of that is Space Marine 2 came out, and I didn't like it. I thought it was a overpriced game. I didn't think it was a bad game. I didn't think it was a good game, but I didn't think it was $70 worth of game. And I had made that clear in a veterans gaming group that I'm in. And holy cow, you would have thought that I went to these people's houses and then shit in their Cheerios and then kicked their puppy. Because it was just like, you don't know what you're talking about. You just don't understand the genre, all these other things. And like maybe that's fair, but at the same time, if another game came out with all of the fanfare and all of the like mysticality that Space Marine 2 had when it launched, and it played like a button mashing, like third person, just like spam the attack button game, I'd have said the same thing about it. It has nothing to do with it being Warhammer. It has to do with the fact that I just felt like it had very simple gameplay, and it just wasn't for me. So again, this is why I kind of avoid a lot of GW stuff when it comes to reviews, because it could be viewed like it's just too polarizing and divisive. But we're gonna get into it. We're gonna like just rip the band-aid off. If you don't agree with me, that's fine. Drop a comment. You can tell me how wrong I am, and that's okay. It's not the first time I've been wrong. It won't be the last time I'll be wrong. And if you like the game, awesome, man. Don't let my opinion on something deter you from enjoying it or not enjoying it. do your thing. And also, like I said, like just because I like or don't like something, that doesn't mean you have to or don't have to. Don't let me take your joy away from life. I don't want that power. Before we dig in, if you do like Old World and you do like fantasy rank and file games, there's going to be some Amazon affiliate links in the description, and those will be for some Litco movement trays, so check those out. I appreciate the support. So now we're going to dig in, and it's only been 5 minutes, so I'm not as chatty as I usually am. What is Old World? And let's look at the ease factor, right? I think the best way to approach this is, first of all, if you don't know what Old World is, if you're coming into this with a fresh perspective, it is what we call a rank and file game. Some people call it sword and board. There's a few other terms for like the fantasy rank and file stuff, but it's rank and file. You have formations, right? If you're not familiar with that, your units move in formations like squares, and movement's very linear, and you use maneuvers such as pivots and wheels. So if you've played any games where like vehicles have to move and then pivot and then move type of thing, almost all your units are going to move in a very similar manner. Your units are going to have facing, and it's based off the front of the unit, stuff like that. All of this stuff kind of factors into its ease because it makes it a much more complex game than games like AOS or 40K, because in those games your models have 360-degree view, you can see through a lot of things, you don't have to worry about a lot of things. And because of the fact that you have facing and you have these weird restrictive movement rules, your positioning matters a lot more. Couple that with the fact that the game is very rules heavy. The core rule book, and this is the one, like this is like the hardback you buy off the website. So whether or not there's other books out there that have a different page count or whatever, that's fine, because sometimes they do like paperback versions and stuff. But the core rule book is 350 pages, and the rules themselves start on page 91. So we're talking somewhere in the range of 200 to 250 pages of rules once you account for like index and, artwork and stuff like that. So it is a massive, massive rule book. Then when you're building your army lists, there's a lot of detail that you can add in. You can have different loadouts for your units. You have magic items and different weapons on your characters, spells, all these different upgrades. So again, there's a lot going on. It has the feel kind of like an RPG, right? You get some of that customization that some units have, especially characters, can make it feel almost like a role-playing game in some ways. And it does implement USRs, which, again, Universal Special Rules. We covered what those are in the Firefight and in Halo and Warlords. Like I've talked about them before. Just know that they are just a pool of special rules that everybody has access to. I'm not going to dig into it any deeper than I already have. USRs do help make games a little bit easier because everybody has access to the same pool of rules for the most part. So it makes it easier for everybody to know what's going on with everybody else's armies and rules. Some armies do require special army books, while others haven't had their book released yet, which means you can just run them from the core book. But by the time the game is fully released in the wild, pretty much every army is going to need an additional book outside of the legacy or PDF armies. And even some of those may end up getting a book. To the best of my knowledge, GW has never said legacy armies will never get a book. They just said legacy armies don't have books. So it's one of those, like, if the game does well, it wouldn't surprise me to see some of these PDF legacy armies getting their own books at some point. But that's just opinion. I don't have any insider information. I don't know anything. Just know that wouldn't surprise me. The other thing to know is there's pretty much rules for everything in this game. And honestly, a lot of games that you play, you're just going to get a lot wrong. And that's just the way it is. There's going to be a lot of like flipping through books, making games take longer to reference rules constantly. That's just the nature of a game like Old World. So for the ease factor, it is rules heavy, multiple books for a lot of armies, very complex movement. We're going to give it a 2 out of 5 just because there is a pretty steep learning curve for it. The game plays very differently than most games that are on the market right now with regard to its level of simplicity because it's not, where most games are pushing towards this like streamlined easy. Old World was like, nah, dog, we're going straight back to Old Hammer, and we're bringing back all the deep layering. Now, being a 2 out of 5 doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's not an easy game to just pick up and play. Interactivity. Now, I will say, because interactivity is one of those things that's kind of weird because you almost have to grade it on a curve within the context of what the game is. And when you compare it to previous editions, because Old World is effectively just Warhammer Fantasy 9th edition. It's really what it is. And when you compare it to older editions, there have been some improvements over earlier iterations of the game. The way spells and dispels work are the real standouts on how interactive the game is, but it's not a significant change. So it's better, but it's not amazing. It does use the GW standard I go, you go. And I will tell you again, like I said before, I try not to let my emotions and feelings kind of dictate how reviews go, but I don't like that structure. I didn't mind it when I first started playing in 1990, whatever, in 3rd edition 40K, when pretty much every game I had played at that point, because I forget, but we had a handful of other games we played that weren't GW, and a lot of them used this structure. So when everybody was doing it, I didn't mind it so much. But now that I've explored other formats, I find this system very restrictive, very uninteractive. It can create very one-sided games. So the more I play in these systems that aren't I go, you go, the less I like that system. So if you're just now looking at Old World and you've never heard of it, if you're looking for something that plays like Warlords of Erewhon or Bolt Action or Firefight or Star Wars Legion or any of these other games where you have different action economy, order activation, stuff like that, this isn't for you. If you don't mind the structure of like, hey, I'm going to take my turn, why don't you go get a sandwich? Then this game is probably more in your wheelhouse. And again, when I say that, it's not to put it down. I know players that are like, I like this format because it allows me to step away from the table if I need to while you take your turn. I'm not constantly having to be there monitoring. When you move, I can just like go to the bathroom real quick and come back and nobody's waiting. So there's pros and cons for each system. I just, as a player, I prefer things that are more interactive. The downside to this type of format, though, is that a really good turn can just decimate an opponent. Because I do my whole army, start to finish, on my turn, with Old World having an exception that we'll get into in a minute. But with me doing my whole army start to finish, if I have a really good turn, it can make playing out the rest of the game pretty much pointless. Because if I have a turn which, like, either I get good dice, I just get some lucky charges, or some really lucky shooting, stuff like that, I can do enough damage, or if you fail enough leadership checks, for example, but enough damage can be done where it's just like, this game is just over. There's nothing we can do about it. That's it. And so, because it's that structure, it does kind of create those scenarios sometimes. And like I said, the biggest complaint I have is that it feels more like I'm playing in my game, you're playing your game, we just happen to be at the same table. Combat, like I said, is the one exception to this because combat in Old World works off an initiative system. So every unit has an initiative stat. You choose a combat, whoever's the active player. So if it's my turn, I choose a combat, and then we resolve that combat in initiative order. So if I have like an initiative of 9 and you have an initiative of 5, even though it's your turn, when you choose that combat, my initiative 5 fights, and then your initiative, or my initiative 9 fights, and then your initiative 5 would fight. Now, charging does give bonuses to initiative. There's spells that give bonuses to initiative, so there's ways to kind of manipulate that in the game. But generally speaking, that's how it works, is you're just at the mercy of initiative when you get into combat, but that's the closest to being really interactive the game gets. Like I said before, some players enjoy the format of this game. It has really become my least favorite as I've played more and more games. So again, this is a personal thing for me. I just feel like there's better ways to make games at this point, and I would give interactivity a 2 out of 5. Also, again, there's not a lot that you get to do. Like if it's your turn, I'm just sitting here. I'm just watching. At some point, you're going to tell me what dice I need to roll. I'm going to roll them, and then I'm just going to go back to spectating. And so like that's why we give it a 2 out of 5, because it's not a I'm going to move this here and now you get to activate a unit, and it's not a back and forth interaction. It's really just a I'm just going to do what I want, then you're going to do what you want, and that's the way it is. So investment. I'll be honest with you. Initially, I expected the game to have a lower price tag. You look at how Heresy was at launch. You were getting kind of like more models for a lower price tag when we compare them to like GW pricing. That has not been the case. Old World has been like it's expensive. You do get more models, but I was really surprised at some of the price tags on the Old World units. Um, Gosh, I'm trying to remember. Like some of it is not too bad, and some of it's just absurd. Like the Boar Riders, I think were 65, maybe they were 80. I don't know. I don't remember how much they were. Something was like not bad, and you get I think like 10 cavalry in the box, and it was like okay, this is reasonably priced. But then there was one thing where you get like 20 skeleton warriors or 20 foot soldiers, and it was just like $80, and it was like holy cow, uh, that's a lot of money. So it's one of those like it's kind of weird in the way it's priced. If a standard game is 2.5 thousand points, you're going to have to drop a significant amount of money and time on your army. Obviously, there's third-party options for models, but you're still going to need to build them. You're still going to need to paint them, you know. And your money and time investment will be different for different armies and different army builds. Bretonnians have a lot of access to knights, so you can play a more mounted cavalry knight heavy army, which would arguably potentially be at least a smaller investment on, time and paint, if not on money. And some of the other armies out there are going to be much more infantry heavy, and you're going to take more time, etc. So it's not a one size fits all, but just know, like, to get to a full game with all the things that you're going to want, it's going to be a not insignificant amount of money and time, which I get, like, that's the hobby that we are in. But I would argue that Old World is probably more of an investment, especially with time, especially when you consider the learning curve and everything else that goes into the game. Like, it just is more of an investment, which I touch on here. Games require core rules and army books, which is more money spent, more time reading and learning. And again, this isn't a bad thing. It's just this is how this game is. Learning the game, like I said, does require a significant time investment. And, so I've played multiple games of this, and there's still times where we have to look stuff up. And I'm like, not to toot my own horn, but I'm actually pretty good at retaining and remembering things. So with games, let me rephrase that. I'm good at retaining and remembering stuff as it pertains to games. You could tell me something, and 5 minutes later, it's fallen out of my head. But man, I play a game once, and I could probably walk you through how that game plays for the rest of my life, whether I like it or not. So learning it does, and I still find myself having to look things up for Old World just because of how much there is in it. Even seasoned players make sure they have core rules with them for constant rule searching, and this is true. I have managed to sign up for 2 tournaments. Both tournaments have been canceled due to players dropping, which I'll kind of touch on towards the end of the video. But, you know, each event where there was at least one other person besides me that showed up made sure they had their core rule book with them, just because this is a rules heavy game. You go to a 40K event, you don't see a lot of core rules floating around, and part of that's because of sites like Wahapedia, but part of that's because 40K is generally a little easier, and that it's easier to retain. Despite its cost, I still believe GW makes some of the most gorgeous models on the planet. They can charge what they charge because whether you like them or not, most of their models are some of the best models on the market. That's just how it is. Um, there's they're gorgeous. Even their older stuff, right? Like even the kits being released for Old World are some of the best medieval fantasy miniatures you can buy. Now you might not like the style, right? And some of them look dated with their posing, and that's okay. But the way they do their scaling is very nice because it allows you to get more detail on the faces, the heads, the hands. Man, like they just are really good looking models. And sure, there's like 3D printing companies out there, and you can get all that. But most of the time, I like the GW stuff better. Um, I love the GW Men at Arms models, for example, for Bretonnians. I love the GW Dryads for Wood Elves. It's hard to replicate those models because they're just that nice, that good, they're that gorgeous. So, from that level, the investment is well worth it because A, if you ever decide to resell it, GW models do retain their value better, just because their models are generally just nicer than a lot of other companies. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't other companies closing the gap, but I'm telling you, like even their old fantasy medieval stuff, really gorgeous. So, for investment, this isn't a plug and play game. Be prepared for a time investment and a dollars investment. That comes from both buying and learning rules and buying and building and painting models. What I will say is if you have a community for it, it is worth the investment. If you're interested in a rank and file game and you have an old world community locally, it's worth it. If you don't have a existing community, I think you're going to just be better off finding something else. Even if you buy the models and use them for other games. Just because if you don't have an existing community for it, I think you're going to struggle to build one because of the barrier for entry, because of the complexity of the rules. And I want to touch back on what I said about the tournaments. Now, I've signed up for 2 different tournaments for Old World. And I've tried to run 2 tournaments for Old World. So now we're talking about 4 different events. Both of the events that I've run, I've had 10 plus players in register. And the day of the event, I've had an 80% roughly attrition rate where I've showed up and there's like 3 people there out of 10 plus registrants. And I basically have said, well, everybody gets a prize. You get to play a couple games and I'm going to send you home, or I just cancel the event. It's up to you. I will leave it up to the players because some of them like drove a distance to come. So I want to at least make sure they get a game in. Both of the events that I went to, one of them was small. I think it had 6 players. I was the only one that showed up. Got there, looked around, and was just like, cool, I'm going home. The other one was a big tournament. I think it had 12 or 14 registrants. I showed up, and there was one other player there. Everybody else had dropped. They canceled the event. So I don't know if the game is struggling to build a community, or if I've just had really bad luck with events locally, or if it's a little bit of both. My guess is that because regionally, we are such a 40K locked area, it's just hard to build communities for other games. And that again, it's not a knock on anybody. It's not a knock on non-GW games. It's not a knock on GW. But in my region, 40K has almost like this stranglehold where even AOS communities, and that's probably our second biggest community for tabletop gaming, but even AOS is just like you might get 10 players. But if you run a 40K tournament, you're gonna pack it out. You could be, and fortunately right now we have a lot of good TOs running events right now, but I have seen it in the past. You can have a bad TO with bad terrain and bad organization still max out and pack out 40K events. And that says a lot. When you can have bad organizers packing out events and people leave complaining about bad terrain, bad this, bad that. And then you can run another event and still pack it out. And people already know what they're getting into going into it. That tells you what kind of stranglehold the game has on the communities. It's why I've struggled to build like a firefight community locally. Now it is growing, but I'm trying to build these other game communities up so that we can have some options. It's never good to have a monopoly, you know? If everybody only plays one game, like that's not good. That's not good for businesses. That's not good for communities. It drives out competition. I mean, we all live in a capitalist society. We understand how that works. You know, so it's just one of those like build everything else up. So it's one of those like I think that impacts it a lot for Old World because as a player, right, in my area, you can go, oh, I can buy this Bretonnian army, or I can buy this 40K army. If I buy the Bretonnian army, maybe I'll get a game in every month or two. Maybe. But if I buy this 40K army, I'm going to get at least a game a weekend if I want it. So it's like, which one sounds like the better investment for your time? And that's kind of what we're going back to here. If you have an existing community, and this is a game you're interested in, it's worth it. If you don't have an existing community and you think you're going to build it, if your region is anything like where I live, you better really evaluate the interest in your area before you dive into it if you don't want to just be sitting on fantasy models. Sorry for the big tirade. Fit and Finish books are available in hardback. They're beautiful. They have nice art. They're very, very like resilient. Mine's lived in my trunk and in a backpack. It's in great shape still. I believe there's paperback copies available for a lot of stuff and PDF or EPUBs. I'm not sure what format it is, but I know you can get digital copies. I do like that they still offer the digital copies for Old World because with games like 40K, they're just like, nope, you either get the app or you get the book. And really, with the way they update stuff, you basically need the app anyway if you want an official rule source. Despite being older models and kits, many of the kits are still beautiful and stand up to what many companies are doing today. I've already touched on this, and they do kind of maintain the game. Like they've released some FAQs, some errata, stuff like that. So they are aware of the game, and it is being maintained. So overall, I'm going to give Fit and Finish a 4.5 out of 5. And honestly, the only reason I don't give it a 5 is because they're not really updating anything. They're just kind of rehashing stuff that they've done. With today's technology, I think that could really create some beautiful, beautiful modern, like heroic dragon kits and stuff like that. But I already love their fantasy line, so to me, 4.5 out of 5 seems very reasonable. So in our normal format, we're going to talk about what Old World does do well, and then we're going to talk about things it can improve on. And this first sentence is going to seem like kind of a jab, but it's not. It does an excellent job of capitalizing off the nostalgia of old fantasy and the nostalgia that old fantasy players have for the glory days of Old Hammer. Now, I'm not putting them down, and that's not to say it's not a good game or it is a bad game. But what it does say is, at first, this kind of seems like just trying to capitalize on a need. And I don't mean that from a, like, ooh, there's a niche in the market that needs filled, but like, hey, I bet if we sell these, people will buy them, and then in a few years, we can just, like, drop it and nobody will care. I don't think that's the case. I think that it's going to get maintained as long as it continues to sell. I think, and I said this before in earlier videos, I think that this is a test run. And I think if the game does well, they will maintain it. And I'm one of those players that it capitalized on. So again, I'm not saying this as a negative thing. Excuse me. I love rank and file. I love old fantasy. And it mesmerized me when they announced it. I was so pumped. And I've made videos about it. You can look through my backlog. I've made videos about it. I was super excited. I had like a countdown to Old World. I went through all the leaks and stuff. I even did a reaction to the battle report that they did on the Warhammer Plus. I was ready. It does improve on existing systems to create what is possibly the best and cleanest edition of Warhammer Fantasy. And that's true. The fixes to the leadership, the fixes to magic, it's a very clean game in a lot of ways. Whereas, like in previous editions, there was some muddiness to some of these rules, and it was just like an impossible to learn game in some ways. It does capture the spirit and play of older editions of the game very well. And again, this is for better or worse. Because again, I am not a fan of the structure, but that's the only complaint I have about Old World, outside of a couple of like one-off rules. There's a handful of rules where I'm like, this is bad. But generally speaking, like, the structure is my only complaint. If it went away from the I go, you go structure and went to some kind of other structure, I think I'd just be all in. It does capture, I said that, all right, heroes feel heroic, magic feels magical, and magic items feel special. And that's a good thing. It's a pro or a con depending on what you want out of a game. It is kind of hero hammery. So like your heroes are like the center stage. They are not support. They're not there to make the units around them better. They're there to just torpedo into things and just like wreck shop. That's what they do. It is hero hammer. And that's why I said it has a kind of an almost RPG feel to it sometimes. You know, your heroes can feel very strong and powerful. Spells can be very powerful. Wizards are very powerful. Magic items can mean the difference between winning and losing a combat. So like all of these things matter. So if you want a good hero hammer experience, I think Old World does that very well. It does fill what I consider a void in the gaming world by providing a game and a system with very deep and complex rules and a very nice fantasy-based rank and file game. I know there are other rank and file games out there. The what is it? Song of Fire and Ice, stuff like that. But I don't know that any of them do what Old World does. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't played a ton of them. I played Kings of War, but I played Kings of War in like first or second edition, and I couldn't even tell you what it was. We're talking 10 years ago. So if I had to guess 10 years ago, it was probably middle to late first. And at that point, the game just felt like Diet Warhammer Fantasy. And that's not knocking it, because my understanding is that's kind of what it was when it came out. Um, so it's not that it's bad. It's just like, eh. But it does kind of fill that void. It provides players with a deeper, more involved play experience. Army construction makes sense. It does do that well. Like, you've got a force organization to some degree. It probably needs a little tweaking, but generally speaking, it works really well. It forces players to have to play things that most players would probably just eschew because, my dragons, I gotta have my dragons on the table. And it's one of those, like, that's, again, just a personal gripe of mine. We're playing a war game. Your army should look and feel like an army. Like, if I just wanted to play dragon battles, I just play a different game. And that's kind of how I look at it. What could it improve on? Well, like I said before, finding a way to make the game more interactive. It doesn't need to use actions and alternating activations, right? We don't need like a firefight or a Necromunda style system. But there are definitely ways to improve on this. But, if you look at GW's big box games, AOS, Heresy, Old World, 40K, they all use these old GW systems, and GW is not in a rush to modernize it. Now, I don't know if that's because they're just like, we need to be different, so that people know it's a GW game. Like if it's almost like intrinsic with the brand at this point, or if it's just, hey, we're still selling, so why change? Right? Like if we're still selling a ton of models, we're still selling a ton of units, and people are still playing our games, why change? And so like I'm not going to pretend like I know the mentality here. And there may be plenty of people out there who disagree with me, who are just like, nah, the game's fine, man. Like it's just your opinion, and that's fair. You know, I think, the way they modernized some of the games, I don't like. I don't like the way they've modernized AOS and 40K in terms of like interactivity, you know. Uh, and so what I mean by that is if you like 40K, I hate Overwatch as a stratagem. Nothing will just like make me want to stop playing a game more than getting overwatched every single turn in my movement phase. And part of that's because I play Dark Eldar when I play 40K, right? Like, I know this. I'm playing a glass cannon army. I already play an army where I have to have perfect positioning because if I get out of position, you're going to kill me on your turn. But now in 10th, I play an army where if my positioning is not perfect, I'm also picking up a unit on my turn. And so, like, that just pisses me off. So again, this is a personal thing. Again, there's been plenty of people who are like, well, I don't think Overwatch is that bad. Well, that's fine. I'm not telling you to not play it. You want to play 40K, that is all you, man. I'm telling you that one rule right there is enough to keep me from playing it. And, I don't want to take your joy away. Have fun with it. It's just not for me. So I just don't like the way that they've tried to modernize their rule systems by allowing players to interact in other players' turns because of the structure of their games. Like, bro, if it's my turn, it's my turn. You go make your sandwich, you go take your poop, and then you come back when I'm ready for you. Like, not this, like, oh, well, it's your turn, but I'm going to move, and it's your turn, but I'm going to shoot you, and it's your turn, but I'm going to do this other thing. Like, it's just one of those, like, it's almost like they're trying to have it both ways, and I'm not a fan. I love the way Lord of the Rings is structured. I love the way Necromunda is structured. I love the way even Blood Bowl, because of the fact that your turn can end at any time just from a bad die roll, it just makes the structure of the game feel less painful. So, again, I'm not trying to knock anybody. This is what I think it could improve on. They could find a different system to modernize it. They don't have to do actions. They could do phases still and just alternate between phases. If we go back to the previous, the eighth edition Kill Team, which it wasn't Kill Team's 8th edition. I mean, like the Warhammer 40K 8th edition, they did the Kill Team. I would do all of my movement. You would do all of your movement. And then we would alternate everything else. And even a system like that would be really good. Like, that would be really good. Because, again, then it's not just like, well, I'm going to move, and then I'm going to shoot, and then I'm going to charge, and then I'm going to fight. Hope you still have models, right? So just any kind of tweak to me that could be improved on. There are a handful of rules that really break immersion. And again, like I said earlier, there's a couple things where I'm just like, this is a bad rule. The way character challenges are handled are kind of immersion breaking at some points. I wouldn't call these major, like they're not like deal breakers for me. They're just like minor frustrations or things that could like get a slight tweak to make it just a little bit better. And if you are not a fan of like Monster Spam and Hero Hammer, this is probably not the best edition of the game for you. Infantry do tend to underperform, and it can basically turn into just like kaiju battles, And if that's what you want, that's fine. Like I said before, I just want an army in my war game. Like I'm not here for World of Tanks or World of Dragons. I'm here to put an army on the table and have a battle with another army. So that's kind of my personal opinion on things that could be improved on. Final verdict. I will say Old World is an okay game. It does deliver exactly what it promised. At no point was it like over-promising and under-delivering. It is a return to the Warhammer Fantasy universe. I played 5th through 7th edition Fantasy. I was super pumped for Old World. But like I said, once I started playing other games and their structure, I realized how much I disliked this structure. And so, like, that does influence my opinion on this review a lot. It does feel like a big part of this initial release was nostalgia sales fueled, but I will say that as the game has sold, it has gotten more support, which has been good to see. I really like the old kits, and I'm excited to see them. I will play Old World. I don't like, oh, I'm not playing that. I'll play it. I just prefer to play other things at this point. And so I'm going to get the models. I love the models. So it's one of those like, I see the old kits. I actually just ordered the Bretonnian Great Weapon Commander. So it's one of those like, I'm here for it. I love this. And like I said, I would have liked to see GW take a little bit more risk to try to introduce something actually new. Sorry. Overall, I think they tried to play it very safe with their rule structuring, and I'm sure that was a calculated, like, this is going to what's maximize sales, and I don't begrudge them for that. At the end of the day, if they lose money, like, that's bad for business. I'm just saying, from a fan perspective, I personally would have liked to see maybe a little bit more of a risk taken and saying, hey, we're going to try to restructure the game a little bit just to kind of like make it more interactive. But overall, I give it a very average 3 out of 5. Excuse me. And a lot of that comes from, like I said, it's a very difficult game to learn when you first get into it. It's got a high barrier for entry if you don't already have models. And, you know, I think the structure of the game could get tweaked or improved upon, but it is a very good, well-written game with very good rules. Like, overall, the game works, it functions, it does what it's supposed to do. And like I said, the only way I don't recommend this game to people is if you don't have an existing community. If you think you're spearheading this community, you better do some research first, because this is kind of a niche game and you're going to need to like really dive into that research before you commit to it. So that's going to do it. Let's wrap this up with a big shout out to my immortals, Lord Wellingstone, Danny Boy. Thank you for the support. Again, if you want to support me, there's going to be Patreon and fourth wall links in the description. And thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Sorry it's a little bit long. Have a good day.